Am I Jewish? Is this Jewish? I am no more Jewish than when I set my Jewishness adrift from fundamentalist religious practice. I am no more Jewish than when I refuse imposed definitions of what Jewishness means.
That was Stanford PhD candidate Jonatan Tadmor reading from Charles Bernstein's essay, Radical Jewish Culture, Secular Jewish Practice. What does being Jewish look like for a secular Jew in poetic writing and in life? What are the contexts in which writers feel compelled to make their Jewishness explicit, and when might they leave it unspoken? I'm Shana Hammerman, and this is Cite and Sound, the Stanford Jewish Studies podcast. Here, we host conversations with scholars and artists as we explore Jewish scholarship, culture, and history. On today's episode, we welcome Charles Bernstein, a prolific poet, essayist, editor, critic, and teacher. Bernstein's CV captures over 4 decades of work and reaches nearly 100 pages listing his many accomplishments. In spite of his near half-century of experience, Bernstein arrives at some of his ideas late in his life, or too late, as he talks about here. Bernstein joins John Tadmor to explore this phenomenon and what it means to be a Jewish writer. And now, the conversation.
Okay, Charles Bernstein.
I guess so.
Welcome to Stanford Jewish Studies. Welcome to Sight and Sound.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and with you.
We really appreciate you coming. I thought we would start with a reading from your last book, The Kinds of Poetry I Want, 2024. There's a section called Summa Contra Gentiles, an oration in 16 cantos. And I would love for you to read the part Altercockers from it, if you wouldn't mind.
So, The Kinds of Poetry I Want, Essays and Comedies. This is the first piece in the third act. The third act is called Double Talk, which I write about, especially in respect to Sid Caesar. It's a very important figure for me, and also influence in terms of the other Jewish comedians that I've been engaged with and write about in this book, including Groucho Marx as well. But Sid Caesar is a little less iconic in some ways than Groucho Marx, but a huge figure in the early 50s. And it's a section called Summa Contra Gentiles, an oration in 16 cantos. And so this is a lot of things about distress or things that have happened to me that I would be better off forgetting. But as I say, somewhere in it, there's no statute of limitations on distress or on your feelings. In this context, I thought I would read also the epigraphs to the whole section, Summa Contra Gentiles. The first is a kind of a reworking of Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. I have set myself the task of making known, as far as my limited powers will allow, the truth that the poetic faith professes, and of setting aside the errors that are opposed to it. To use the words of hilarity, I am aware that I owe this to art as the chief duty of my work, that my every word and sense may speak of it. And the first section is called Altercockers, cranky poems for aging with anger, resentment, intemperance, and regret. Poems to help you age without losing your negative capabilities. This anthology collects centuries of poems of bad advice and denial, guaranteed to pour salt on wounds large and small, from poets who developed exquisite expertise in nursing old wounds in old age and exacerbating infirmities, real and imagined. Sections include, I don't want a revolution if I have to dance. Despair springs eternal. I did it before you were born. And incontinent songs. And here's a blurb from the book. The name was withheld at the request of the family. A comfortless collection bound to agitate and annoy while discouraging the elderly from aging gracefully. Coming soon from You Bet Your Life Presses, Dorothy Parker Collection. So that's the...
Wonderful, thank you. Why was this the first part? Why is this the opening to a 16-part
Well, because each of the sections, in a way, deals with a kind of grumpiness and things perhaps better, rather than just forget about it. It exacerbates old wounds. And so I was interested also in framing the whole section in this comic way, because the sections are not comic at all. But in this context, they have that aspect. I mean, in each of these sections, I work on revising each section so that there wasn't a kind of personal animosity or settling scores, or wasn't interested in that tone. But still, I was interested in the history of my encounters with these different situations, from my first experience going to college and the different responses I've gotten, plus mixed in with other unrelated things. So that's sort of the nature of that work. I mean, there's a famous concept from Adorno, but also Edward Said, of late work. So, I mean, I wrote this when I was over 70. Late work is often, in those accounts, a kind of fragmented, unresolved moment, like famously the Beethoven string quartets, but they also represent a break from earlier work, which was more unified. And in my case, my work would have started out late, and so it can't be late. So I've come up with a term for this kind of thing: too late work, TOO, too late, which of course could mean, it could suggest it's jumped the shark. It's not working anymore. But my sense of too late is something else, which is the sense that whatever it is that you tried to do in your life, you can no longer do. You can think about it, but you're not as actively in the present moment, in the contemporary, as an actor and as a player in that. So the work is sort of removed from that social field, even if it's about it. So it's too late to do anything about it. Too late, my troubles. And of course, here I'm parodying the kind of uplift and self-help and affirmative aspects that is so dominant, both in the popular culture, but also what people imagine poetry to be. For example, poetry is supposed to offer you comfort. I'm saying, no, let's do poems that offer you discomfort. Or poetry is supposed to affirm whatever your values may be. And my thought is, why not deride whatever my own values would be, or whatever the reader is? So it comes out of that nexus. You might be the only person who would ever take my whole body of work and in a discussion pick that particular piece, which many would consider a throwaway work. I actually was delighted that you did that, because it isn't a throwaway work to me. It's very much, it serves an aesthetic function.
Absolutely.
To disrupt aspects of both resolution and coming to terms with. So I'm sort of not interested in coming to terms. The old guy is finally coming to terms with the demons and so on, because coming to terms doesn't interest me aesthetically. And it also connects up, as I said. You Bet Your Life is a Groucho Marx's television show, so it's very explicitly pulls into that kind of trickster, almost slapstick vaudeville or Borscht Belt strain, which is one strain of my work. It's not a dominant strain, but it pops up here and there.
So later on in the piece, in Summa Contra Gentiles, you also write about being a first-gen, kind of in this, one word, you say first-gen, realizing you're kind of this term that is now used, kind of realizing you're Jewish. There's lots of kind of autobiographical elements.
Right. So that piece, First Gen, which comes up right after this opening, and it relates to it, because I'm going back to things that you could say, why return to these matters? But I wanted to, because for one thing, I didn't fully realize at the time. So I grew up on the Upper West Side, which was a very particular cultural experience. Went to Bronx Science, and that world was one that was what I was used to. I knew nothing about Harvard College, but got in, and it was the place that seemed like one should go. I didn't really even question that value. I was happy I went there, but I didn't really like the place. But I never really understood exactly what was going on at a social level. I had met many great people. I had friends and professors, so not really the faculty, but there was an aspect of social exclusion among my fellow students, which was striking to me, but I didn't understand it and never experienced that.
This would have been in the early 70s.
Well, 68.
68 you
68,
started at
69.
Harvard.
I started in the fall of 68. So also that year we also had the strike and the protests and so on. So in that context of the theater that I was doing and the anti-war movement, not so. But in the context of Harvard College and the kind of social world and the clubs, I didn't even know certain things existed, which were evidently very famous. I
Mhm.
never even knew there were clubs really the whole 4 years I was there. It was something I felt excluded from because I didn't even know they existed. I didn't know the people who were in them.
Right.
In a way, it's the fraternity world, although it wasn't called that, but similar. It was unexpected because I imagined Harvard would be more like Bronx Science. The students at Bronx Science who were all just absolutely committed to study and to good fellowship and working together. But it was a very serious intellectual environment there. I was really shocked at the anti-intellectual or atmosphere among maybe a good number of the students who came from a different environment, or maybe it was the casualness about it, but this kind of doing the least you can just to get by and so on, showing a lack of interest in the actual work that I thought universities were like. I never encountered people like that actually, and of course
Hmm.
those people often went on to be very successful people in the world, and perhaps also that was a mask for them. I'm sure we're all in our masks of hiding their own insecurities and so on. So I didn't know, for example, what first gen was. Nobody ever used that term. I didn't know about the history of Jews at Harvard. My being Jewish didn't occur to me because was in a world in which that wasn't really that notable. Most of the people in the world that I had been in up to that time were Jewish
Hmm.
because those environments were heavily Jewish. So it was not so surprising for someone who didn't grow up in the environment that I was in. I think if somebody had grown up outside of the Upper West Side and so on, and the rest of the country, they would have expected that because it would have been the East Coast. It would have been different, but I didn't, and so it was very useful to me. It gave me a fundamental distrust and deep aversion to aspects of both intellectual and cultural life among very successful people. So it solidified my sense that I didn't want to be a part of that and that I had
Hmm.
a lot of problems. When I say that, I'm not talking about the library or in fact the faculty or the content of the classes,
Right.
all of which I took enormous value. I'm really more talking about how many of the students that I studied with, were contemptuous of modern art. Didn't really reading was not the main thing that they were doing. I mean, these are fine things for most people are probably that way, but I was very idealistic, and I came out of a world where we went to the opera and the museums and so on, and so that was what I thought college would be like, and that was naive.
Yeah.
And then I dropped away from anything to do with universities for almost 20 years after that, and then I became a professor. So I think that actually did me well in my work as a university person, not getting a graduate degree, not having anything to do with it because I still could relate to lots of students in undergraduates and graduate students who had a similar distance from the kind of peer pressure and conformity that would go on, which is different in different places. The peer pressure and conformity among PhD students is not like what it is for undergraduates, for example, but nonetheless also problematic. So to try to create environments for people who were not comfortable with that aspect of university life.
Speaking of kind of approaching the kind of the people not used to the regular practice of university life, I want to talk a little bit about an essay you wrote called "Radical Jewish Culture, Secular Jewish Practice."
Mhm. Right, so
The
that was
book.
originally Stephen Paul Miller came to me one day and said, we should do something with that title was mine. The original title was Radical Jewish Poetry, Secular Jewish Practice. We should do something, about that, especially thinking of historical poetry, but also contemporary poetry, because it really wasn't something that was discussed. At the Zukofsky 100th anniversary, for example, the centennial, which I was an organizer of, I was struck with maybe 40 or 50 different people writing about Zukofsky. There wasn't a single person at that conference that discussed his being Jewish. Now,
Hmm.
at that time, I would say, it's fine. I don't think people need to discuss biographical matters about a poet, and there are many other things. Zukofsky had lots of, but but really you can't read Tsukowski without
No,
knowing who he was. And he
people
writes
reading those
he
full of
yeah,
Yiddish, it's
yeah,
full of
he
yeah.
writes so much about his Jewish culture that it was odd,
Yeah, it's like not
and also
talk about Elliot
Zukowski,
being a Christian,
yeah,
you know?
Zukowski was born the same year as my father, and also
Mhm,
the Lower East Side. My father was quite a bit older than me when I was born. I was 49.
right.
So, I mean, it was also something I didn't necessarily write about at that time.
We'll
So
get to.
still, we thought we needed to do something, and so we got a space at the American Jewish Historical Society, the Center for Jewish Culture, which was very nice auditorium, and we filmed it. And on Penn Sound, you could see all of it. And we brought together Marjorie Perloff and Jerome Rothenberg and Paul Auster and others. So that was the context in which I wrote
Mhm.
my contribution. Later, there was an edited book, which is still available from the University of Alabama Press on the radical Jewish poetics.
I'd love to read you a little bit of what you wrote in this
Mhm.
essay, and I'd like to hear how you think about this today, because you wrote this over 20 years ago now,
I
right?
can't remember when, but it does seem like a while ago,
I'm sure it's been a while.
and yet it's still,
Every
in a sense,
like
too late
most things.
work, as you've just said. I mean, it's,
Absolutely.
I was over 40, like they say. I could now study the Kabbalah. I had come of age.
I see. Great. So let's see what you write. You write, "Am I Jewish? Is this Jewish? I am no more Jewish than when I set my Jewishness adrift from fundamentalist religious practice. I am no more Jewish than when I refuse imposed definitions of what Jewishness
Mhm.
means. I am no more Jewish than when I attend to how such Jewishness lives itself out, plays tunes not yet played. Jewishness can, even must, in one of its multiple manifestations, be an aversion of identification, as a practice of dialogue and as an openness to the unfolding performance of the everyday. Call it the civic practice of Jewishness."
Oh, I had
What do
not.
you think of that?
Well, I think it represents what I think in a very succinct way. Not having reread it, I realize I repeat different versions of that in different places. It sounds possibly rather commonsensical, but as you know, and in this context I'm speaking, and very rarely am asked to speak in context sponsored by Jewish organizations for reasons that have to do with the content of what I'm saying there. Because while to me this is unexceptional and a huge part of American Jewish life, the Jewish organizations are not focused on what I'm talking about there. And people outside of that who do that also tend to not focus on the Jewish frame of saying it. So I think
Yeah.
that was a key recognition to me of the value of addressing this question head on as opposed to allowing it to be implicit. So part of what I'm saying, even with Harvard and all the rest, is that Jewish content was to me a given. I remember when I was here at Stanford, John Felsener, who the Salon scholar and translator editing the Norton Anthology of Jewish American Poetry, was talking to me about what might be included in that, and he did include me, but they wanted stuff with Jewish content and Jewish themes, and my view was that that has nothing to do with a poem that I write that has a specific reference to Jews or Jewish themes isn't any more Jewish than anything else I write. It's a misunderstanding of what that is. But of course,
Yeah.
it's understandable within the kind of ethnic, multicultural
Right.
environment of an anthology
Sonnets about
but
gefilte fish and so
right.
on.
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
I'm happy to do a whole, cycle of poems about gefilte fish. I feel very strongly about it.
I actually do
But
too. We have
but
something to talk about
but
later.
exactly, and of course I have because once I saw it, it gave me a whole new range of, shtick
Right.
and other things to include. So you see from Shadow Time on, there is more of that content, but, I did think that this issue was worth, addressing. But what I realized maybe later on, and this is the too late, is that
Mhm.
the nobody in my experience as a poet, wouldn't recognize that I was Jewish. I mentioned this to a wonderful poet, a friend of mine, not Jewish, for sure, and, saying, I didn't have the kind of explicit, and she said, "Well, of course, we all knew you were Jewish," which was a kind of a shock that she said it, but I had understood, but of course that's true. There was never any question in my case. It might be somebody else, but I wasn't passing in any way for being anything other than I was. In fact, it was always exaggerated, so it didn't seem necessary to me, and, I think part of the making explicit is something that I resisted. So it was more a
Mm,
recognition
mhm,
that I took for granted the world that I came from, and as I got older, I realized that world doesn't exist so much anymore,
right.
or doesn't exist anymore, and that I couldn't take it for granted anymore.
The kind
So
of
that
world of secular
right. So
Jewish
bringing in
culture.
the explicit Jewish references, and I'm not saying content because the content was there all along,
Well, about
is a
content.
recognition partly of the fact that I could no longer take that for granted,
Yeah.
that there wasn't that world in which that would just be assumed that it was a base. And that maybe, and going back to Harvard, it wasn't the case after I was 18, but it just took me a long time
Mm,
to realize it. And I was privileged and fortunate. My father would not have experienced that and didn't,
right.
and other people, and in fact, most Jews and most times would not have experienced that. There was a very unusual time in the '50s and to the mid-'60s on the Upper West Side, which was a very safe and uncontested place for someone like me. And we see now what a rare moment that was historically.
Right.
But when you're inside it, you're not
You
so
take
much
it for
aware that you're
granted.
in a rare historical moment that's a great privilege and even luxury, a luxury made possible by my parents and all the other people that created that world that I benefited from but didn't actually create.
Right. I want to go back to what you were saying about the Jewish content, because there's also kind of a Jewish interpretative lens that
Yeah.
we talk about. And you mentioned in that essay, you talk a little bit about PRDS, Pardes, the
Yes.
method of interpretation,
Yeah.
and you explain the P, that's pshat, literal meaning, R, remez, suggested meaning, D, drash, allegorical meaning, and
Yeah.
of course, sod, S, which is the hidden or
Yeah.
mystical or esoteric
Yeah.
meaning. And then you write, you call it paradise, but maybe it's just people really digging the secular, which I, one, love.
PRDS. Yeah.
PRDS, people really digging the secular.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
the secular, of course, is a contested word. In fact, I didn't really think it was contested until a friend of mine, Murat Nematjad, is a Turkish Jewish poet, was very annoyed by the term secular when we came out with that. And I said, well, this is just a term used for non-observant Jews.
not religious, but non-observant. That
Let's just say
distinction.
non-observant to
That
be more
distinction, I think, is
technically right. A
important,
very
right?
important distinction,
Yeah.
but it wasn't that we didn't want to exclude people who had different attitudes toward observance, and in fact, the complexity of what observance is for lots of Jews. But it was a very specific intervention about a frame that was being uh, overlooked. It wasn't to say that we were trying to take over the general understanding, which but to note that this very important history within American poetry, in particular, would be better understood within this context of people who were leaving the world of religious life and congregations and so on, especially of the Zukofsky, my father's generation of poets, sort of famously. And not just in the political sense, because you have Yiddishkeit culture, you have all kinds of things that relate to that, but really as poets and what that had to do with American poetry. So it was an intervention to say that. And so the PRDS becomes, later I come up with the term midrashic antinomianism, which is another way of understanding it. But these are just levels of understanding commentary as being fundamental, and really in a way that there's no poem outside the commentary, because you're reading it, you're writing it. The commentary is a set of layers of interpretation, but crucially for me, the layers are often discrepant, so that they don't pull together into a total. And this idea that there isn't a total correct reading is fundamental to me. They're shards, and they're broken. And by seeing the edges of the shards and putting them into different patterns is where you get what the heart of the poem is. And so you have to have contradictory interpretations. So that the PRDS remark is a kind of is connected to that.
Wonderful. Let's move on to a little bit of a different topic, but not unrelated, of course. I want to talk about a libretto you wrote.
Hmm.
So in 1999, you were invited by the composer Brian Farinow to write the libretto for an opera that he was commissioned to compose by the city of Munich. He chose to write an opera about the life and work of Walter Benjamin, and he got you to write the libretto.
Right. So Brian is a professor emeritus here at Stanford.
Yes.
And at the time, he was at the University of California at San Diego. But since we're here in Stanford, I want to think about Brian and his great contribution. So he decided to do the Benjamin and made that commission. And then he asked me to know my work. And also my work in that context that wasn't really dealing with explicit Jewish themes. And Shadow Time was the transformation in that way. I read Benjamin early on, probably when I was a teenager. He would have been with Wittgenstein, a very crucial figure for me. So I was ready to jump in. But in that case, we were talking about the Kurban and the Shoah and his death. And the opera starts with his death. Yeah. So
it's really interesting what you're saying about this being the explicit Jewish themes. So on that note, I'd love to read a part of Scene 5, which is called Pools of Darkness, 11 Interrogations. And this interrogation is called Baal Shem Tov, disguised as vampire, Rebus.
Okay, so if you will read the Walter Benjamin Roll, this is an interrogation by the Baal Shem Tov of Benjamin.
Okay, you can interrogate me because I've been interrogating you for a couple days now.
Okay.
So I will answer.
Is allegory better than symbolism?
No.
Is symbolism better than reproduction?
No.
Is reproduction better than tragedy?
No.
Is tragedy better than alarm?
No.
Is alarm better than aversion?
No.
Is aversion better than engagement?
No.
Is engagement better than detachment?
No.
Is detachment better than assimilation?
No.
Is assimilation better than estrangement?
No.
Is estrangement better than allegory?
No.
Is allegory better than symbolism?
No.
No, no, no.
No, 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 no.
So the key word there in that is what Benjamin is saying, no, which is negative dialectics in the Adorno sense that I'm interested in exploring.
Let's go one by one. Pshat, Brash,
Right.
In the performance itself, by the way, at least the one that's been recorded.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, in the opera, yeah.
in the opera itself,
It's completely scored, yeah.
Obviously beautifully scored. And also I noticed that the WB, the Benjamin part, starts overlapping with the Baal Shem Tov part.
Right.
Even before there's a round structure, and
right.
even before that kicks in,
Yeah.
like, there's some
Well,
sort of
Brian created, even in the parts that are recited, it's like Sprachstimme. He has the intonations that's entirely scored. There's nothing that's unscored.
amazing.
And one of the things that Brian did in the opera overall is to overlay some of the text so that you have multiple texts sung at the same time, actually in different tones too. So different keys, different pitches, actually, different pitches, literally. So they were with tuning forks when they were doing it to get the different pitches. So when you hear it, you hear something that's very occluded, that has this multiple stuff going on, but you can't separate the layers, but you know that there are multiple layers inside. So it's a way of understanding how Brian was dealing with the Benjaminian themes in the opera through the text. So the text is not legible in the way that when I read it, in most of it is not legible quite in this way. So reading it or hearing me read it is very different than the experience of the opera.
Like here, what's interesting. So lists are always kind of really fascinating to me. In writing, that's something you do extremely well. The kind of concatenation of things and objects. This one is almost like a Mobius strip of a list. Do you have something to say about kind of the ordering of the things, the logic, the flowing of these particular kind of concepts from, allegory, symbolism, reproduction, tragedy? These are all obviously parts of.
If we're to talk of Benjamin, then it would be constellation is the transformative word to take us from different levels that are discrepant, or modernist fragmentation. So fragmentation or parataxis suggests two disconnected things that you bring together, like in collage. Now, that's not untrue in the sense that at a technical level, but once you think of constellations, and for Benjamin, that would be like looking in the sky and seeing the connection between the different stars. The stars could be, huge distances between them. They're not together, but nonetheless we see patterns, and the patterns are not actually fixed, but they're projections, and one recognizes them, and you can see other kinds of patterns. So understanding this conception of constellation is another way of understanding the levels and layers that can create patterns, but also that the patterns shift is crucial to me. You don't just have one pattern that's transcendental and that's fixed, but you have constantly shifting patterns. And that's what it is from a Benjaminian point of view to be a historical time and in the veil, inside the veil of history, which really we don't get outside of except through what he calls the now times, zeitgeist, excuse me, so it is in the zeitgeist, but the emphatic now time is almost a light breaking through the veil, but the veil never never disappears.
Before we move on, I'd love to ask you a quick question about Yiddish,
Uh-huh.
if that's all right. About
Absolutely.
Yiddish and then about Hebrew, really quick. You write in an interview that you collected in your book My Way, the autobiographical interview
Mhm.
with Las Pequeño Glazer. You talk about a lot of interesting stuff. One of the things you mention is that you didn't hear much Yiddish in the house, but your mother says that the only time she remembers hearing her parents speak Yiddish was when they were saying something they didn't want her to
Oh, well, that's the
understand.
famous, yeah, I don't even remember my mother saying that, but my father grew up on the Lower East Side and certainly spoke Yiddish. But I never thought about it really until later, and that's it fits into what I'm saying now, and it's sort of shocking to me that,
The kind of secret language.
no, it wasn't secret, actually, it wasn't secret. It's something different than that, but it's just that
What was
I
it?
wasn't concerned about it. It
Yeah.
wasn't something that I thought about, until
Mm.
much later. My father, like many of the Lower East Side immigrants, my father was an immigrant from the Pale of settlement, um, the Russian Empire. My grandparents would have come over to New York about in the 1880s, so it's the most common Ashkenazi Jewish story in the neighborhood that I grew up in. He had no interest in Yiddish. He was in America now, and I can hear now in background where the Yiddish would be in his voice, but he never referred to it, never discussed it, never talked about it, never talked about everybody goes back what town you're from. My father never talked about, or any of his many brothers and sisters or relatives. Of course, it was associated with something bad to them, and they were happy to be in America and make that new world for them. And they didn't talk about that previous world the way my generation started to think, well, what was the history and the connection to it? It certainly wasn't the case. My father was a businessman, and he was not interested actually in that, or maybe that's superficial to say. He felt it was better just to not dwell on that. Also, because he was he was already almost 50 when I was born, so it was a long time ago. So it was not something I was aware of. My mother, even less so, in terms of that. And so I wonder, what does it have to do with me? And then, of course, I see, well, of
So when
course,
does that meeting happen for you?
when do I realize that? Well, I mean, it's always there. I think as I say, I become more interested in these kinds of things, like with the Radical Jewish Poetics book and Shadow Time, more explicit about it. Is something that I address more explicitly at that time. And I'm interested also in the construction of the history of American poetry along that lines, and other poets who are significant to me in this constellation that I write about, including Gertrude Stein, being another very important figure who is not always thought of as Jewish, but that makes her even more of an important precursor to me. I wrote my undergraduate thesis, which you had to do at Harvard College, on a reading of The Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein through Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. I called it informally Three Steins. And then my advisor was Stanley Cavell. It was obviously there was an enormous amount of Jewish content in what I've just said at Harvard in
Yeah,
1971
but at
to
the
be
time you didn't
right.
even
Oh
that
no,
was not on the table
I
because you bring
yeah,
yeah.
I was 100% aware of it, and
Oh
partly
yeah.
it's a response to what I was saying as my experience. What I'm saying wasn't explicit. That is explicit, and I even called it Three Steins. I was totally aware of that and totally aware of what I was talking about, but it was implicit in the sense that I wasn't writing about it except in terms of the philosophical investigations and the making of Americans. And Cavell also didn't really thematize this aspect of his work at that time, but it's clear that it's in Cavell's background as well. And the fact that we became so very close in a way as a student, he was very supportive of me. I think all of that is clearly part of the story we're talking about, but it wasn't ever characterized as Jewish per se, because it was implicit. To me, it was obvious. You couldn't miss it. But then, of course, you realize over time that unless it's made apparent, a lot of people don't see it. They're not aware of those kinds of connections and what the cultural connections are. And so that's where I took on a task in a way And the other part of it would be with the Benjamin, I realized that the intellectual world that I connected to, apart from America, especially European, was this European Jewish world of Karl Kraus and Adorno and so on. And that the continuation of that was really mine because of the extermination, the systematic extermination of the Jewish population of Europe. That history had no continuation there in Europe. To some degree it does, and it's wrong to say that it wasn't there, but certainly decimated, but thrived in the U.S. So to me, I feel that my tradition is as much that as being an American, and that's also a tradition that exists in books and so on, but the continuity was broken through. I should mention Jerome Rothenberg in the Radical Jewish Poets Symposium. Rothenberg was crucial there, maybe so crucial I didn't mention in his book, which he called at the time Big Jewish Book, or Exiled in the Word was a later version. It was absolutely fundamental to me. And I was in touch with Jerry from when I was just first read him when I was 18 and Technicians of Sacred, and then we made contact in my mid-20s, and he was a lifelong, very close companion to me and supporter, generation older. So Jerry was certainly a key person in this story.
I want to do a quick round with you. Quick lightning round.
Okay, good. Lightning
because
round.
this is how
But
we.
I'm not running for public office, but
Not yet. There's always a future. I want to play a quick round of you of Jewish or not Jewish. What do you think?
No.
Moving on.
Please do the Walter Benjamin. No.
You want to try?
Yeah.
Let's go. I'm going to say a thing. You say if it's Jewish or not Jewish. And we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Multiplicity.
Yes.
Turkey sandwich.
No.
External pressures.
Yes.
Internal spirals.
Yes.
History.
Yes.
Charles Bernstein.
Yes.
Poetry.
Yes.
Bad interpretations.
Yes.
Weird interpretations.
Yes.
Lenny Bruce jokes.
Yes.
Jokes about Lenny Bruce.
Yes.
Anti-Semitism.
No.
God.
Yes.
All right.
Not exclusively Jewish now, of course, you're just saying.
Now you're adding more answers, more words to the
I'm just
question.
saying, when I'm saying yes, it's Jewish, but it's not
We want
only,
decisive.
not only Jews.
It's only yes or no.
Okay,
there's only yes or no, and there's nothing in between.
Right,
You know, that's what we think here at the Jewish Studies
excellent.
Center. All right. So, as in every episode of this podcast, we asked our guests to prepare and share with us a Jewish text that our guests finds relevant to our moment, whether your own or someone else's. What do you have for us? Okay, so we'll end with this. I just want to add another commentary on the most provocative questions was almost thrown in here at the center about anti-Semitism, and I said no, but it's almost a philosophical point of view. But I do think that systematic Judeophobia, which I differentiate from what people often mean by anti-Semitism, Judeophobia is a somewhat different phenomena. Because systematic Judeophobia is so pervasive and often unacknowledged, it affects Jews and Gentiles both, but it actually affects Jews much more because it's their life. So, and in a good way to acknowledge it and talk about it as we are doing, and I'm sure the center here is doing, and I think it's very important. It's part of what I'm saying about the turn I had midway in life's journey to be more explicit, because it's necessary to be explicit about it. I realized that I couldn't. The implicitness was an evasion, right, and a luxury I couldn't afford. No, I'm glad you stopped.
But
for that.
But nonetheless, Jews are as affected by Judeophobia in its systematic nature. They can't not be. So some in a irrational way, some in a way that some of us find problematic, some courageously resisting, some less affected, many more affected, but nobody is outside of it. People can fall into traps on both sides. So it isn't just Gentiles who suffer from Judeophobia. And this is I very indebted to Sandra Gilman and his Jewish self-hatred for that comment. So
Absolutely.
this piece is called Unimagining the Jewish God. It's a remix, and it's all from sentences of other places. And I wrote it for an anthology called Imagining the Jewish God. So I came up with this negative, Unimagining the Jewish God.
Yeah.
To write prose after Auschwitz is barbaric. No use not crying over spilt kreplach. I am a Jewish man trapped in the body of a Jewish man, said the Jewish God. One man's religion is another man's hell. One woman's freedom is another woman's manacles. One boy's fantasy is another boy's nightmare. One girl's reason is another girl's superstition. Common sense is a gift of the gods, but only fools can make a tree. My concern is more what is false than what is truth. The Jewish God is in the space between Professor Kelp and Buddy Love in The Nutty Professor. When people tell you that joke, 3 Jews, 4 opinions, what they don't say is that 2 of them are schmucks, have the same opinion, while the third. I am an observant Jew. I look at all things around me as if they were foreign. Repetition is 9/10 of the law. Nothing ties me to the actual. Nothing tires me as the actual. My work is not liked, but not that not liked. The Jewish God is not imaginable. That's its ace in the hole. In their gloom, the Jews come and go, talking of Bergen-Belsen. The only true innovation is God's. Others pay cash. I believe in my disbelief, have faith in my reason. Judaism wasn't built in a day. There is more to liturgy than doctrine. Once in a blue moon, God has no doctrine, no morality, no responsibility. To sin against God is to use that name to justify any action or prohibition, whether murder or martyrdom. God is weak and imaginary, a flickering possibility. The dogma of an omniscient and omnipotent God maligns hope and denies the sacred as it turns its back on the world. I've got authenticity. You've got dogma, proclaimeth the Lord. The unironized life is not worth living. This the Lord has not taught and has not blessed, so that whatever truth it may come to have would not be destroyed at the outset. You know that joke? 3 Jews, 4 opinions? It should be 1 Jew, 3 opinions. Judaism is the record of God's vexed struggle to have a juridical relationship with Jews. The Jewish God said these things to me. I have rendered here what was said as faithfully as possible and have made changes only in cases that would intensify the bathos. This is our task, to imagine no whole from all that has been smashed. Even forever is not forever.
Charles Bernstein, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure to talk to you and be here today.
Today's episode was produced by me, Shayna Hammerman, with help from Eva Clem. Sound editing and design by Romy Kiorian. Original music is by Jeremiah Lockwood. Cite and Sound is a production of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford.
Stanford University.